Well, welcome to our Fringe meeting, which has the title, Feeling the Effects, Tackling Problem Drinking and Crime. Or, as we would say on a tabloid newspaper, this is the Fringe Binge, or the Binge Fringe even. And the Policy Exchange have assembled a learner panel to discuss the issues, the issue that is on everyone's lips here at conference, alcohol abuse. When I say it's on everyone's lips, I mean it because party conference for some people turns into nothing short of a 4-day bender. There are drinks at the back there, I've noticed as well. There are bottles of red wine there. But our panel tonight are strictly sober. In fact, Diana's got the strongest brew there, which is a cup of tea. Yeah. And that's quite weak as well. What we're here to discuss is the link between alcohol, abusive use of alcohol, and antisocial behaviour, or perhaps as we'd say on the Sun, booze-fueled mayhem. How many of you have had a drink today, by the way? Can I ask how many have already had a drink today? Nobody's had a drink in the audience today. One. Oh, well, that's quite interesting. But drinking and crime have always seemed to be inextricably linked. Many politicians and the... there we go, I should have taken this off. There we go, it's going off. I'm so sorry. There we go. Many politicians and the anti-drinks lobby link booze and violence, and others say it's just a culture here, and people who are going to cause violence anyway, and drink is not the real cause of it. So what we need to discuss is what we do about crime related to alcohol. Is the answer to punish the responsible, moderate drinker, or is it to tackle the behaviour of the minority? Should we all pay the price for the minority who can't control their own addictive and destructive behaviour? Now, there's a rival binge fringe going on down the road, where Alistair Campbell is arguing that we should bring in minimum unit pricing. There's other things. Is there a culture today of banning things for everybody because a few people step out of line? What do we think about minimum pricing and bans? What do we think we should do about pubs which serve alcohol to people who have had one too many? Now, our 4 panellists, none of them are here to promote a book today, but they're all here to come up with some suggestions about how we deal with these problems, links between crime and alcohol. So I'll give you a brief introduction. On my right, I've got Diana Johnson, who is MP for Hull North. She was a junior minister in the Department for Schools, Children and Families, as it was called at the time, and is now the Shadow Home Affairs Minister. She's a barrister, so knows a little bit about the law, I hope.
A long time ago, oh my goodness.
And
yeah, I've forgotten.
Well, in fact, we've got 3 barristers on the panel. And then we've got Vera. Vera Baird was an MP for Redcar between 2001 and 2010, Mo Nolan's own seat, if I remember. She was ousted by a Lib Dem, of all people, in the 2010 election, but thankfully she was recalled to public service when she won 2 years later, when she was elected Police and Crime Commissioner for Northumbria. And I think you've been doing quite a lot of work in there about antisocial behaviour, neighbourhood policing, and drug-related.
Yeah, and you put that so beautifully, David. I was recalled to public service.
Miles Beale is the Chief Executive of the Wine and Spirit Trade Association. Now, we had lunch when he got the job, and I can reveal what we had to drink over lunch. We had the finest bottle of mineral water. So, it was a very clear-headed lunch we had, and a very interesting one too, which I'm sure he'll share with you some of the views he has on how the industry should think outside the box to tackle alcohol abuse and crime. And then Max Chambers, who's head of crime and justice, a leading welfare to work pioneer previously, and for the Policy Exchange. And you studied law too, did you not? Did you get a degree in law? Yes. So that's our panel, and we'll start, I think, with a little introduction from each of them of 5 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the floor. So can I call for Diana Johnson, MP, to talk first, please?
Okay, well, I'll start where we are at the moment with the government and their approach to tackling crime and antisocial behaviour in relation to alcohol abuse. And many of you will know that the Prime Minister said he was going to introduce minimum unit pricing, and Theresa May actually came to the House of Commons on a Friday to make a statement to say, yes, we're ploughing ahead with this, and we're going to consult, and we're not even consulting on whether we should introduce it, we're consulting on the level of what it should be at, which was for the government 45 pence. So that was the way, that was at the heart of the government's alcohol strategy. They were saying minimum unit pricing would deal with problems around binge drinking, antisocial behaviour in town centres and city centres at weekends. And then go forward a few months and suddenly there's a screeching halt. And Jeremy Brown, the Minister, comes to the Commons to say, no, we've consulted and we've decided we're not going to do this. And so at the moment, we don't really have an alcohol policy from the government which is going anywhere. The Labour Party's view on the minimum unit pricing was that we would support the government in taking this forward, but we had some issues that we wanted to have addressed. Two key issues. One was the anti-competitive nature of this proposal and the fact that Europe were probably going to get very involved with it, and we know that's already happened in Scotland where they're trying to introduce minimum unit pricing, so we're watching to see what happens with Scotland. And the second point was about the windfall that would befall the supermarkets. Tesco and Sainsbury's would benefit from any minimum unit pricing, and we thought there ought to be a way of looking at that money and making it available to the public purse to use for either preventative work or treatment. So we were concerned about the government's policy. And in Scotland, many people will know, they were using minimum unit pricing to address some of the health problems associated with alcohol. But our government in the UK was saying, no, this was about crime and disorder. They were very clear on that. So where we are now is, it seems to me, the government have backed off from minimum unit pricing. I think Linton Crosby had said, get the barnacles off the boat, and this policy was seen as a barnacle, so they've dropped it. The government haven't done terribly much in terms of licensing reform or new policies on alcohol, and I'm really pleased that Vera's on the panel tonight, because one of the things the government have introduced is a late night levy, and that was designed to, where there were problem areas, for the local authority to be able to raise additional money from licensed premises that opened after midnight and use that then to pay for additional policing to deal with the crime and disorder issues. This hasn't been taken up very widely. I think Newcastle is the only local authority that's progressed this, although I hear you're, from a previous meeting, are also looking at it as well. So it'll be interesting to see whether that's going to go ahead and what Vera as a Police and Crime Commissioner feels about that, because that is one of the things they've introduced. And the EMRO, the Early Morning Restriction Order, again, to try and tackle some of those problems with the late night economy. Again, I'm not sure many local authorities have taken that up. But what does seem to work, actually, aside from what national government can do, is what local partnership arrangements can achieve. And we know already in places like Ipswich, they've agreed to take off the shelves very strong alcohol, cider and lager that's used by people who have chronic alcohol problems. There's similar things happening in Haringey. And in Manchester, they wanted to introduce a minimum unit pricing in their licensed premises, but unfortunately that's not been possible. But I think local authority areas are trying to be quite imaginative about how they tackle some of these deep-seated problems around alcohol. I ought to pay tribute to some of the work that's gone on with the retail side, because they have used the ID cards very effectively now, so young people are challenged to prove that they're of an age where they can legally buy alcohol, and I think that's a very good initiative. And there's also the schemes like the Purple Flag scheme, where voluntary pubs and clubs come together and work together in a city centre to make sure that troublemakers are kept out of premises and that door staff work together. And I think all of those local initiatives and partnership workings are really good. Just a couple of other things I wanted to say. I think there is an issue about licence fees, and I think the LGA are calling for full cost recovery of licence fees, because we know at the moment local authorities are having to find about £18 million to cover the cost of licence fees and enforcement that are not covered by the actual fees that licensed premises are paying. And I do think when we know local authorities are going through such awful cuts, they will be looking to see and call on the government now to introduce full cost recovery. And I think that's something we need to consider if we want to ensure enforcement action takes place. And just very finally, I just wanted to again reiterate my concern about the fact that our young people in schools are not getting good education around issues on drugs and alcohol, sex and relationships. We know if you just tell kids not to drink or take drugs, it doesn't work. You have to be more sophisticated. You have to use evidence-based models, which we know work, and we know in some schools that's happening, but in the vast majority of schools, young people are not getting the life skills they need to make good and sensible choices for themselves. And I also think that means bringing parents in and making sure that parents feel able to talk to young people about alcohol, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what age a child can start drinking and when it's okay and all of that. So I think parents and schools are an area that the government currently are just ignoring. Michael Gove's kind of set his face against doing anything within schools. And I do think there's a role for businesses as well. In a previous Fringe meeting there was discussion about employers taking quite an interesting view about if their members of staff are caught in the city centre with antisocial behaviour on a Saturday night, whether that's something that employers ought to be aware of and thinking about, just in the way that lots of contracts now have issues about drink driving, and if you're found guilty and convicted of drink driving, there could be employment repercussions. Perhaps businesses have a role to play in dealing with some of this antisocial behaviour as well. Okay.
Thank you. Now we're going to hear from the industry itself. Miles Beale of the Wines and Spirits Trades Association. Let's hear from Miles, please.
Great. Thank you, Dave. The first thing to say is, yes, I represent the alcoholic drinks industry. So the Wine and Spirits the Wine and Spirits Trade Association, as well as the Wine and Spirits Education Trust, effectively work for the broad church that is the alcoholic drinks industry. We've got about 340 members. We range from very large to very, very small. And it's partly about trying to help our members do their business. There are a few sort of facts, and again we always stray slightly into it. There's a certain amount of guilt about having a drink. In reality, of course, no one should feel guilty about it, unless it's making them behave irresponsibly, inciting them to do things that harm others. Most of us, I'm happy to say, are responsible drinkers. Most of us drink within the guidelines set by the Chief Medical Officer. So the place I start from is, what kind of problem are we dealing with? Some people are fairly surprised when I begin things like this by saying, actually the industry entirely agrees with the government and Her Majesty's opposition, and indeed most other political parties, that there is a problem of alcohol misuse in the UK. The question is, what do we do about it? And just a couple of little facts to start with. It's important to look at the evidence. I think the government's change of heart on minimum pricing comes on the back of this. Consumption in the UK has fallen by 16% since 2004 and by 3.3% in the last year alone. Therefore, it cannot be related to a financial economic crisis. It is, in my view, the emergence of a change of culture that I think we needed. But I think it's well on its way. And actually the question really for the government 2 years ago was, why was it seeking to regulate and impose a particular approach when we seem to be making progress? So sometimes nothing happening, no further regulation, no intervention from politicians, dare I say it, can be the right answer. What I really think is important is that we consider things beyond price. But I will start with minimum unit pricing just quickly, because we were in part responsible, I hope, for helping the government make sure it looked at evidence. The truth is, minimum unit pricing wouldn't have worked. There's no evidence it would work. It's never been tried anywhere in the world. There are quite a few examples, no doubt been cited in another Fringe meeting about now, around sort of Canada and Australia and other places, I'm always very happy to debate those because they're not even close to a minimum unit price. And indeed, where they've been tried, they've either been dropped or they're pretty easily disprovable. For the UK, we are the second highest taxed nation in the EU on wines and the fourth highest on spirits. If high prices were going to change our behaviour, then it would have happened already. The culture change we're seeing comes from other things. It's particularly important for me to note, I think, that the thing that's fallen fastest amongst dropping consumption in the UK is consumption amongst the young. So people, frankly, under the legal age to drink are drinking far less than they used to, and that has to be a good thing. The last point about minimum pricing is we still don't know if it's legal or not. Now, I'm the only person, I think, on this panel, apart from maybe Dave, who isn't a lawyer, so I will leave that for them to debate, but my understanding is it's pretty shaky ground. So what I'd really like to get into is, well, if we think there's something needing doing here, and we think culture change has started, how do you get it happening more quickly? Well, the first thing, and I would say this, but I'll say it very strongly, is working in partnership with the industry. Actually, the industry already does an enormous amount, and that has a lot to do with consumption falling by 16% since 2004. It may sound counterintuitive, but most of the businesses that I represent are interested not in having consumers drink far too much of their product, but drinking the right amount so that they continue to drink it for for the rest of their long lives. And frankly, it's about social, enjoying something in a social occasion, not something people should be feel guilty about, which they often do. So what actually works? Well, I would definitely agree that education is extremely important. Consumption falling fastest among the young, that's extremely important, and we should build on it. The question is, what more can we do? So Drinkaware currently spends up to £100 million on things like an advertising campaign called Why Let the Good Times Go Bad. That is aimed at young people. It's clearly worked. We should do more of it. It is funded 100% by the industry. Local initiatives that Diana's already mentioned, so community alcohol partnerships, which have seen antisocial behaviour falling about 30% in some of the 50 places where we now have caps. Best bar none, again aimed at the nighttime economy, fantastic results, and all done through partnership working. So police, local authorities delivering particular results in particular problem places. Enforcement, we've talked quite often about that. The figures seem to be changing around, but it's still only about a dozen people prosecuted for serving to already inebriated people last year. I think it was 3 the year before. There are laws here that should be enforced, and I think we need to look at that. Finally, Diana mentioned employers. I also agree with that. As part of the public health responsibility deal, which the government has now put all of its weight behind again, I think, to deal with alcohol misuse. What else could we be getting employers to sign up to? It's interesting to me that my industry, companies in the alcoholic drink sector, have some of the most developed alcohol policies in the workplace, which you would expect and you would hope, but I'm pretty sure others could learn from that. And I think the final thought I wanted to leave people with was simply that I don't think anyone has a monopoly on the right ideas here. So we've talked about local initiatives. I'm sure there could be more. I know Alistair Campbell has talked about treatment for those who are already addicted. I think it's 6% of those who are dependent drinkers get treatment at the moment. He wants to get it up to 15%. I tread with some trepidation when I say I'm tempted to agree with him, but frankly I am. Drunk tanks is another idea. I don't know if it's workable, but I'd certainly be happy to have a look at it on behalf of my members. And I think one of the things I'd like to get out of today is some other ideas that we might look at that haven't been looked at again and again, something new.
Well, thank you, Miles. So I'll now call on Vera.
Thanks very much indeed. Police and Crime Commissioner, just in case none of you know what it is, since there were very few participants in the elections to put us in post, a Police and Crime Commissioner, visible presence with an obligation to mediate, as it were, between the public and the police to make sure that the police do what the public wants. So that's, and has a police budget, can appoint a dismissed chief constable, a fall off a cliff provision which I didn't expect anyone to use. And so that's that dimension, but he's a police and crime commissioner, so also we have some funding for community safety, which is things like making packages to try to separate young people from things that might get them into crime, diversion models, working with the local authorities there, and then we have an obligation to liaise with the local criminal justice boards about the criminal justice process. So if you think kind of two-dimensional approach, which is all of the police and liaising with the public and the police making the police do what the public want, and then the whole process from the possibility of diversion, prevention, engineering out crime at the community safety partnership all the way across policing and into the criminal justice process. So just so you know, that's what we do. In the Northeast, we have an organisation called Balance, which is, it's called the Alcohol Office of the Northeast, and it's the only one that there is. It's funded by the police, it's funded by the local health sector, it's funded by the local authorities. We have got a sharp edge problem about drinking and disorder in the Northeast. We have the highest under 18 hospital admissions from alcohol related complaints of any region. We have the highest number of 11 to 15-year-olds who are drinking too heavily, and although numerically fewer 11 to 15-year-olds are drinking, as Miles said, the ones who are drinking far, far more. Of 1,100 police who were surveyed in the last couple of months, just since I came into post, 1 in 5 of them had suffered an alcohol-related assault in the last year. So it is quite an issue. And in Northumbria, the specific area where I am, which is Northumberland up to the Scots border, and Tyne and Wear, so that's Newcastle, Gateshead, Sunderland, North Tyneside and South Tyneside. In Northumbria, it costs £912 per person for the costs of the damage that alcohol does, either in terms of disorder or in terms of health. But that quantification is present compared with 848 nationally. So we, as I say, have a sharp edge problem. About half of violent crime, not confined to Northumbria now, nationally, is linked to alcohol. 43%, the figure is much preciser about that because it's domestic violence. 43% of that is linked to alcohol. Let's pause there and make very, very clear that alcohol is not the cause of domestic violence. And if you got rid of all the alcohol in the world, it wouldn't get rid of domestic violence, which is about power and control, but it is made worse, and there is that link with alcohol. So we have issues to contend with, and drunk tanks are, in my view, the last thing that will assist with this. You need to triage people who are on the street in a state of apparent drunkenness. Quite a lot of people with mental illness are arrested for drunkenness and turn out not to be drunk at all. They, of course, have their drinks spiked when they're out, and shouldn't therefore be put into a blame situation. And also, of course, people who are drunk need care and need to be watched whilst they are recovering. Furthermore, if you consider, vulnerable young woman out in the nighttime economy perhaps, and her friends wanting to know what to do to help her, the last thing they're going to do is to take her to any authority, isn't it? If what follows is she's put into a drunk tank and charged 600 quid by G4S or whoever's running it, and then gets a penalty notice, they're going to take her in the opposite direction when what she needs is to be protected. Instead, in Northumbria, what we have done is we have trained door staff to have a safeguarding component in their approach to young people in the nighttime economy, in particular young people. We have been very well aware that there are predatory men around city centre nighttime economies, and also there are vulnerable young women, and there was a terrible rape in Newcastle in September last year, where a young woman was put out of a club because she was very, very drunk indeed. I think the doorman would have thought he'd done more than he needed to, because he took her to a taxi, tried to get a taxi driver to take her. She was literally falling all over the place. I've seen the CCTV. Another guy came to help him, walk her along. The taxis wouldn't take her. I think the doorman thought he'd done all he could and needed to get back, so he left her with the other guy, who was, of course, the rapist, who then passed her on to 2 other people. So now the door staff in Newcastle will not exclude somebody who is drunk, particularly a vulnerable young woman, but won't exclude a young man if they can avoid it too, because they're preyed upon either for sex or for their wallets or their mobile phones. What they will do instead is try to persuade them to just sit down in a quiet place and remain there. And they will call for the street pastors, or they will call for, we've got something called the booze bus in Newcastle, which is run by the ambulance service. They will call for that and somebody will come and help, or if they need the police, they will call the police and the police will come, or if they can find her friends, then they will get her friends, or if they can get her home, they will get her home. And that's looking after the vulnerable component, which will include also not, if you're not allowing somebody in because they're drunk, not just putting them away either, but bringing them in if they'll come and sitting them down in a similarly safe place. That component has been very welcomed by the Security Industry Association, who have now decided that it will be national training and that nobody will be a member of Security Industry Association approved door staff, and no one can be a door person unless they are, without having this vulnerability safeguarding training beside them. So much so have they taken it on that it really is brilliant to see. I mean, the door staff said to me that they had seen things outside, but their job was to look after the 4 corners of what they were paid to look after. And so they hadn't gone out and hadn't done things, and they were worried that the police wouldn't want them to. So we've had to do some complementary training with the police as well to make them welcome the door staff taking a duty of care approach, and also not to penalise establishments if they call in the police a lot, as they would historically have done, but to analyse why they're being called to positive if they are trying to support somebody and not a negative. So well has that been taken on that the door staff asked for a badge to show that they had been on the course, and you now have some really hard-looking guys in Newcastle, you know, with bald heads and tattoos up both arms, wearing a badge at their own request which says, "I am a safe haven." And we will have safe havens for them to go to, because clearly the sort of missing component in that is, okay, you can call the street pastors and somebody will come, but we will have a safe haven right in the middle of the nighttime economy, a set of premises which will be run by the ambulance service. And will take in anybody who's vulnerable for whatever reason. You know, they've broken their leg or they've fallen over just the same, but of course the driving force was predatory men. So that, it seems to me, is a much more positive approach than drink tanks, and obviously that's about, as it were, mopping it up afterwards. Let's turn to minimum unit pricing. I'm a very strong supporter of minimum unit pricing. There is plenty of evidence that it works. The University of Sheffield is the expert here, but the World Health Association says there's a substantial evidence base which shows that policies that regulate the environment in which alcohol is marketed, particularly its price and its availability, are effective in reducing alcohol-related harm. On the other hand, school-based education does not reduce alcohol-related harm. World Health Organization also says there's evidence that social responsibility messages from alcohol manufacturers or retailers, whether standalone or added to advertisements, benefit the reputation of the sponsor and do not benefit public health. And since the Portman Group was set up in 1989, which is the root of the sort of conscience of the wine and spirit trade, alcohol-related deaths have gone up by 111%, alcohol-related admissions have gone up by 130%, hospital admissions for liver disease amongst 30 to 35-year-olds have gone up by 300%. There are key arguments for a 50p minimum unit price, and alcohol is now 61% more affordable than it was in 1980, and of course you're surrounded by it. Let me just tell you one interesting fact. Alcohol is sold at unit prices in Haringey, in other parts of North London boroughs, and in parts of the North East at 12p a unit. You know the maximum recommended intake for a man? That can cost you £2.51 to take all of that maximum alcohol in, and the maximum recommended intake for a woman, £1.68 is all it costs to get you that at the current prices. And it is very clear that if you introduce minimum unit pricing, the people who are likely to benefit are heavy drinkers. It's very the people who are price sensitive, heavy drinkers who need to get a lot of drink quickly, and of course the young who don't have a lot of money to spend on alcohol but do have a need to be in vogue. I think that the arguments for minimum unit pricing are very powerful indeed, and it is a shame that the government was persuaded, I think, by lobbyists not to take it forward, and I hope that we will commit to taking it forward together with some sort of way of recouping the extra, because otherwise you just give Tesco more profit, and I agree with Diana, that's not what it's about. As to its lawfulness, well, the Scots are going to find that out for us. We do have the first late night levy in the country, which will start in November to coincide with the renewal of licences in Newcastle. And its nature is fairly straightforward. It is a levy upon all licence holders who work between 12 and 6. So after 12, there is an additional levy, which is, I think, is linked to square footage. I'm not absolutely sure. It's levied by the local authority. And 2/3 of it, after their administration costs come off, go to the police for policing, and 1/3 remains with them for some use. I think an issue going through the House of Commons was that nobody specified that the late night levy proceeds should be used in the area where they're levied, but they will in Northumbria. They will be used back in Newcastle. That's obviously what it's for in the city centre. And it is to avoid, really, and they will use the terms very strongly, I think, is to avoid offers like the one I saw when I went round with the police who policed the nighttime economy in Newcastle last December, which was 3 triple shots of any spirit for £3.99. You could have 9 shots of spirits for less than £4. Conditions like not doing offers of that kind would clearly be part of the late night levy, and if you're levying tax on people, which is what it is, then you can give concessions to people who adopt best practice, and there are a whole raft of those pros and those cons that Newcastle Council is tuning finally for its people now. So I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that minimum unit pricing is a silver bullet, nor that the late night levy is either, but they are powerfully researched components that can assist here, and it's urgent that we do something.
Thank you, Vera. Some thought-provoking ideas there. And now we'll call on Max to take up the rear end, and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Dave. So I just wanted to start echoing Miles in some respects, just by saying that the majority of people are responsible drinkers, and that a profitable alcohol industry that's worth more than £40 billion to UK PLC is important, and that in moderation, alcohol is an important part of the social fabric of the UK. But clearly, there's a very sizable minority of people who are problem drinkers, and millions of people binge drink regularly. Over 1 million people have a level of alcohol dependency, and as Miles says, and as Alistair Campbell's been pointing out, only a tiny minority of those have treatment available. And on lots of measures, the UK is going in the wrong direction. So we've got 1.2 million hospital admissions in the UK for alcohol-related reasons, and that's been rising steadily for a long time. And in the EU, those levels are going down. Similarly, levels of liver disease and liver mortality are going up in the UK and have been going down elsewhere. But it's not just a public health issue, it's a crime problem as well. And as has been said before, about half of all violent crime is related to alcohol, and 43% of domestic violence incidents as well. So given all of that, our view is that it's very important that policy is properly targeted at that minority, that sizable minority, without penalising responsible drinkers. So in terms of policy, we think the government's alcohol strategy from last year was, in lots of respects, a step forward, particularly the steps to tackle cheap booze, to work with industry on the responsibility deal, and also a number of measures to empower communities to deal with problem premises. In terms of MUP, I think our view was that it was a public health solution to what the Prime Minister called in the forward to the strategy, the scourge of violence caused by binge drinking. So it was very much a crime focus, as Diana pointed out as well, but probably a solution that would have made a difference, perhaps, although the evidence is disputed, a marginal difference to the overall population consumption, but probably wouldn't have reached the problem end of the market, where actually we need policy to deal with the problems that everybody's been describing. So 3 quick ideas, so we've got some time for Q&A, that we think would deal with that end of the market. One is making the late night levy that Vera has talked about more flexible and more targeted at problem premises. So those premises where we're seeing a lot of police and emergency services demand, what about a much higher and more flexible levy targeted at those premises rather than something that's blanket for all the premises in the area? Secondly, and given what Vera said, she probably won't agree with this one, but we suggested before that people who are admitted to hospital should take responsibility for their behaviour and should pay the full NHS tariff cost of their admission to A&E, which would be about £530, and we think would go some way towards driving the kind of culture change that we need, and stop people thinking that the public purse taxpayers can just pick up the tab every time for their behaviour. And the third suggestion stems from a recent trip I took to the US, where I saw the operation of a number of sobriety schemes. So there you can be a court-ordered period of sobriety between about 90 and 120 days, backed up with an ankle bracelet that measures your alcohol consumption levels through your sweat. I've worn one of these for a week, very accurate. And the results are pretty stunning. So they only put problem drinkers on these schemes. Around about 3/4 of people do not drink for the whole 90 to 120 day period. And of all the possible drinking days, so if you've got 1,000 offenders on for 100 days, 100,000 possible drinking days, more than 99% of those days don't involve a drinking incident, as they call it. So we think that the government should go much further, and perhaps other parties as well adopt policies that can see these kind of schemes be rolled out much more quickly, so that we really tackle that problem drinking end of the market, which I think it's fair to say the government's alcohol strategy so far might have missed.
Great, thanks. Well, now let's have some questions. I'll ask you all to say who you are before you ask your question. And I must warn you that anybody asking a question in a drunken or aggressive manner will be thrown out of the room, or we may adopt the minimum pricing model and punish everybody by kicking you all out and abandoning the meeting. So anybody like to start the ball rolling? Well, shall I get the ball rolling? Shall I start? I'll start while you think so. Miles mentioned that existing laws not being used enough, enforced. Drinking has been a problem over the centuries, and we can go back to Gin Lane and so forth. And the policeman used to address somebody for being drunk in the street, or the landlord would say, "Get out of my pub. You're not having any more. You've had one too many." Is that not the answer, Vera? Is that?
I lost focus on which laws Miles was saying weren't used.
Serving to drunk people.
Serving to drunk people, do we need? Can we not use the existing laws to crack down? If your police force, for instance, was to do this?
I'm not sure that that's correct. I mean, if we have maybe melding that in with one of your proposals, which is about a targeted late night levy. I mean, if the policing around the two biggest late town economies are Newcastle, nighttime economies in Newcastle and Sunderland in my patch, and there I would be really quite satisfied that first of all there is some target purchasing done, there's some pretend purchasing, and I am pretty satisfied that if a place got to be known for serving people who were drunk, then they would review the licence, and they have done. I mean, and if you think about the three times 3 units of spirits for £3.99, they reviewed that licence and put conditions on it to stop that kind of behaviour. And that's what we would do with any premises that weren't being run in an orderly fashion. So targeting the late night levy would not be the way we would approach that. What I think we would approach with the late night levy was giving people concessions if they did best practice things, rather than targeting it at kind of bad people who instead we would review the licence. Well, the point of the levy is, of course, to make all the people whose participation in the late night economy is profitable pay some share of that for the cost of policing it, to help make their profit.
Can I just say about test purchasing? Because I do think there's an issue about local authorities' capacity to do things like test purchasing, you know, go into retailers where they might be selling to young people not the age of 18. And I think because of the cuts to local authorities, the point I was making about making sure there's full cost recovery of licence fees would allow more of that enforcement action and making sure that licence holders were doing what they were supposed to do. So I am concerned about that. And on this late night levy, I mean, the problem is with it, it covers a whole local authority area, whereas your problem might just be in the...
Go on.
Well, I was on the Bill committee and we did talk about this at length because we were trying to say to the government that it might be your problem is in a very specific area, not the whole of the local authority. So, for instance, the East Riding Council, which is just outside Hull, that's a really big geographical area. Your problem might be in Bridlington or a town like that. It may not be in all the rest of the local authority area. So I do think it might be that the late night levy needs to be looked at again in terms of making it more specific where it can address the particular problems rather than this blanket approach.
Miles, you think there's not enough enforcement going on, certainly?
Yes, I mean, there's a few points in this discussion. I mean, the late night levy, and I think the space in between Vera and Diana is that it's targeted on a geographical area, and everyone within that area, as I understand it, is effectively, it's punitive, that's the point. So you are required to pay for something possibly happening. Community alcohol partnerships, I mean, it's almost an advert for community alcohol partnerships, which is great, because that is about defining a small geographical area. It's retail led, and the point there is Challenge 25, which I think is exactly what Baird was talking about earlier, ensures that, you know, if you go test purchasing, there are very, very few, if any, failures, because all of the, particularly the supermarkets, take it on board. But in a community alcohol partnership area, there will be a lead supermarket, probably one of the big ones, who trains all of the retailers in the area about what they can and can't do according to law. And indeed, the police in those areas have found that that selling to underage drinkers almost completely dries up. Barnsley, it was a 30% decrease. Durham, 37%. Interestingly, the Home Secretary has most recently said she would like to see more caps and other local initiatives which are tailored appear in more areas. Now, amazingly, in Vera's area there are almost none. We are about to launch a cap in her neck of the woods pretty soon.
Where's that?
It's not for want of trying. It's Tyneside, not for want of trying.
Well, where in Tyneside?
Well, the point about it is we've made the offer for 3 or 4 years and it hasn't been possible, and nobody's been able to take it up because there's been no local partnership, and we hope the Police and Crime Commissioners can play a large role there, and we think the Home Secretary agrees, so hopefully that's an area where we would agree. Areas where we might not agree, on the legality, the point there is if you have a law that says it is illegal to serve someone who is already inebriated, I would agree entirely with you, Vera, that some of the things you've just been talking about are offers that shouldn't really be available, and indeed I'm sure they aren't now. Certainly not legally, but the point there is if only 3 people have been prosecuted for serving to already inebriated people, there's a problem. Either those people aren't being brought to court or they're not being prosecuted effectively, but something is going amiss. And I think that's pretty evidence-based. The last thing I would say, because I can't really let this go, is minimum pricing in Sheffield. I'll say 3 more things on minimum pricing, then I promise I'll shut up because people are probably sick to the back teeth of it. Sheffield produced an academic study in 2009. It said that, for example, 45p minimum unit price, which is what they said you should aim at, would cut consumption by a bit over 3%. They revised the figures this summer. It's come down by 2/3. Okay, same academic institution, same set of figures, slashed by 2/3. Okay, completely different. Now down to 1.6%, down by 2/3, whereas last year consumption fell by 3.3%. So the reality versus an academic model, it's pretty clear which wins. Secondly, heavy drinkers are the least sensitive to price. That is very well documented, so I'm afraid we're on that. That can't be right. Young people, entirely agree, they are very sensitive to price. But if that is the fastest falling demographic amongst the drop of 16% since 2004, and indeed still 3.3% last year, something's getting through. Now, it doesn't mean you can't do anything more, but what we ought to be doing is building on success. So we'd like to help with that as an industry. You can take that at face value, but happy to talk about that in your area if it helps. Last thought, Dave, and then I'll stop. Health statistics. The government's reviewing them. There is a complicated system on public health statistics around attributable fractions, which would take me a long time to explain, even if I could effectively. But it is not possible for those statistics to see a decline in a trend. So they never go down. They just keep going up and up and up and up and up. So I'm not saying we know what the answer is, but I am saying that no one knows the answer. So we do not know what in practice is happening on the ground in terms of health emissions.
Thank you. Max, is there anything you want to add before we
No.
Okay, fine.
Can I just come back on the, and then we should just call it a truce on minimum unit pricing, but the 50 pence minimum unit price. Sorry, I don't think we will be using them anyway.
Okay.
Thanks very good of you, thank you. The minimum unit price of 50 pence, that Sheffield said will cut 3,393 deaths in 10 years. They say also that a 50p minimum unit price will reduce youth consumption by 7.8%.
That's what they said in 2009.
And that's what they say now.
They revised it down.
Yeah, they say it now. Your
I'll send you
partnership, whatever that may be, has never been approached to Northumbria Police. And we will, any endeavour would be very much welcomed. The late night levy is on NE1 only, which is a very, very small part of Newcastle upon Tyne Borough Council. And that's where the levy is, and that's where the levy monies will be spent again. So, however, the technical provision may, I don't think it does, but it may require a whole local authority. The implementation or the amount to be levied obviously is variable, because it is literally NE1 where all the nightclubs and so on are who are going to have this levy. It has not been either unwelcome to the people who are selling in NE1, who are anxious to have a good quality trade, not a very cheap one, of the kind that I've talked about with these appalling special offers. And so the trade itself, I accept in a different manifestation from Miles, but the trade itself has welcomed the imposition of this levy for that purpose. I mean, they're not so happy to be paying more money, because they already pay an inner city levy for NE1, which is sort of business development area as well. So they're getting, as it were, double tax. But I think if you ask them which one they prefer, they are happier that they're going to have a good quality trading position imposed by a late night levy rather than a cheaper one. So I think progress.
Can I ask a question? Because I'm just intrigued on this. How much, Vera, do you think, how many police officers will this provide for that area, do you think?
Well, it depends how it's spent and who spends what now and on it, and how we choose to spend it when it comes to us. What we need to ascertain are what Newcastle spend already toward policing in the nighttime economy. They do pay for taxi marshals. We have 2 taxi marshals who are police officers. So that seems a very sensible thing, because there's often trouble in taxi queues. So they fund those. Whether they would want to carry on doing that or replace it from levy funding, and there are a number of things like that. So we might find there's additionality, but as you rightly say, local authority funding is under such severe pressure that you suspect this is going to be a replacement for some of it, really.
Right, any questions, please? Lady in the third row.
Amanda Callahan, British Retail Consortium, but in a previous job at the Royal College of Nursing, I did one of those Friday nights in A&E, where mostly you just watch people roll in, throw up, dry out, go home feeling very sick. So I'm kind of seeing it from both sides here. Miles, I wonder if you could spell out a little bit more about why the figures are falling, the total numbers, in where you talked about at the beginning, kind of total figures, and then in the last year. What's the reasons for that? Why is that happening?
Well, honestly, if I knew exactly, I think we wouldn't have needed this event. They're ONS figures, so we're reliant on the kind of the regularity of those to see what trends develop. And one of them is overall consumption. So we know that overall consumption is going down. It may have been Vera or Diana who mentioned earlier that there genuinely is a huge challenge around a larger amount of alcohol being drunk by a smaller amount of the population. So and this is why I worry about minimum unit pricing. It would penalise everyone for the sins of a minority, but that minority actually needs help. And I think that's rather Alistair Campbell's point. And I don't think we know how to break that kind of cycle of addiction. It's not really something that I think is good for anyone. But back to the statistics. It's overall consumption, but actually there's quite a few features of it as well. I think the only thing that we are sure about is you can compare them with the rest of Europe. So we are, we were known as the kind of the sick, drunk man, woman, or whatever of Europe, and we're now definitely not. That's tinged with some unpleasantness because there are some countries that talk about the English disease, where they have young people drinking more and more and more. But as far as we can tell, we have the fastest falling consumption rate across the world. Now, we're coming from quite a high base, and actually sometimes it's difficult to compare. So in theory, Germany drinks more alcohol overall, if you measure it in terms of litres, but of course a lot of that is beer and not much is wine. There is an interesting correlation between low tax and low consumption, which feels very counterintuitive, but that's what the statistics say. So the bottom line answer is we don't know exactly what it is, but we can track it for a period of almost a decade, when I think the problem probably was at its height in this country. Personally, I think we're talking about culture and culture change, which takes a very long time. Culture change is inevitably something to do with it, but it's certainly not the only thing. Why is it 3.3% in the last year? Well, the biggest falling area is young people. So it's increasingly, those 11 to 15-year-olds and indeed teenagers for whom consumption is falling fastest. That's where the drink-aware advertising has been targeted. So you hope with the correlation there, because there's a lot of money going into it. Certainly my members are very interested in that because they pay for it. Can we be 100% sure, and should we stop looking? Absolutely not.
Can I ask you about A&E, whether you think that, bearing in mind what Vera said about vulnerable people, but whether you think that drug tax or charging people for the cost of their admission is a reasonable idea?
I'm actually sitting here pondering that question myself, and I couldn't decide which question to ask actually, but thank you. And I don't think that we've had the opportunity to go to our members and actually ask them about this, but in any case, I think this is probably outside of the remit of our members. But I'm wondering, we've got a smaller number of people drinking more. Are we talking about higher incidences of dependency, stroke and or mental health? And then I'm kind of looking at the scenario you describe, Vera, which is very caring and supportive, but is there a flip side to that, which says, so I can just get completely trolleyed because someone's going to look after me? I don't know.
I doubt it, but there may be. However, surely the ideal is to keep people out of hospital by having exactly the kind of provision that we're trying to set up, because you need to save the costs. You don't want ambulances coming out when they need really to be available for people who properly need them. So this kind of process of having a safe haven run by the ambulance service, but on a staffed permanently basis is I think a very good idea. And if you can just keep people there until they get calmer, get better, you triage them and ascertain that it really is drink and not something else, and you also triage them to make sure that they're aware, as it were, that it's their drinking that's caused them and they don't feel they've been spiked. There's quite a lot of drink spiking reported to the police. Then they seem to me to be a good intervention, really. And in a way, obviously we want people to take care of themselves, and so the message goes out: take care of yourself. And there's been a campaign around my place about doing that. Keys, wallet, phone was the sort of resonance of it. When it started, it was about girls, it was about keys, handbag, phone, but I thought that was wrong. But it's about everyone really, and also you have to worry about victim blaming, don't you, in sexual offences. So we send out a strong message: look after yourself. But truly, if people haven't looked after themselves, or if they've been assisted into the state that they're in, and a small step can save them from being vulnerable, then it's good that you have those steps to take.
Okay, we're running short of time here, so we'll take some quick questions, please.
I'm Paul Hegarty from DrinkAware. One of the things that concerns us is the normalisation of excessive consumption in society in general, and that there is firstly too much tolerance of drunkenness, but also that we normalise drinking in situations where there shouldn't be. We did some research a couple of years ago where we looked at the way that alcohol was portrayed in 4 soaps, and the quantity of alcohol that people in Coronation Street get through is absolutely extreme. And actually there is no way that the normal person would normally consume that, and we need to make sure that people aren't given a misleading perception of what is normal behaviour. That people who are supposedly working in a cotton factory in Manchester, which is pretty unlikely anyway, are going out at lunchtime, being allowed to drink alcohol and then go back to work. No factory would allow that to happen. We shouldn't be showing that on television.
How do we do that, Diana? Do we ban TV from showing this sort of
I
stuff?
hadn't thought about that actually,
Yeah.
but you're absolutely right, because they're always in the Rover's Return, aren't they, something? So, yeah, that's a very good point about the way you portray what's the social norm, and I think in a discussion earlier today, it was about young people thinking that every other young person was out there getting bladdered all the time, when actually, as we're hearing, the statistics are showing most young people are not doing that. So I think it is about how you get those messages across, and especially with young people, I guess it is about using all the different networks now, Twitter and Facebook and everything else. And someone was also saying to me about Facebook, you go out and get absolutely drunk one night, and then the next day your pictures are up showing, what a bad state you were in the night before. And that's obviously something that I think most parents would be very concerned about. So it is about how you get messaging across, and I think you're absolutely right about the media and TV and how they portray drinking. Can I just say one thing about the people who are really, I think, storing up problems? And I think it's people like me, actually, of my age group, who are probably now going home every night and having a couple of bottles of wine. And there's a view that that's where the consumption, not that I'm just saying, I'm not confessing here, this is what I'm doing. Although being a member of Parliament, actually. But storing up problems for the NHS, because we know that group is going to store up in years to come more admissions into the NHS with chronic conditions. So I think that's a group that the health lobby are very concerned about, which is obviously different from this issue around crime. But I do think that's a group we really need to think about how you get to that group.
Miles, as we just heard there, is there a case for it working with cigarettes? We should see a bit more careful about what we put on TV with cigarettes now. Can we do something similar with alcohol?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, I it seemed a bit odd for me to be turning around to Paul and saying, actually I think young people are probably being influenced. I mean, they're clearly not being influenced by soaps, and I agree, that's probably something that should be looked at. I mean, I'm not quite sure where my industry would go in kind of, dictating to television programs what they should or shouldn't include, but it's. I think what Paul is saying is, something is built around the Rover's Return or the Queen Vic, you're bound to get, there's going to be drinking, isn't there? I mean, none of it has any sponsor's name attached, which I think would be wrong. But yes, I think there's clearly something that should be done. I mean, part of this is actually about whether it's really reflecting reality anymore. Is it leading, or is it trying to represent real life? I mean, under either circumstance, I think there's probably something to talk about. So yes, we were looking at. I'm not quite sure how we would do it.
Okay. Now I think I've got to shoot off shortly. Is there any quick fire questions with a yes or no answer, or short answers we can get in before we go?
Yeah, David Wilson from the British Beer and Pub Association. I just wanted to say, I was in Newcastle yesterday taking my son to university during Freshers Week, and the first thing we were exposed to when we walked into the hall was a quote from Vera, Baird, and a policeman offering really good, pragmatic, sensible advice to young people about how to handle themselves during Freshers Week. It wasn't patronising, it was full of what you talked about there, that duty of care. And as a parent, it was really reassuring. What's important, I think, is that you're not taking the punitive approach. You're saying you are going to go out and have a good time, but there are ways of doing that where you can keep yourself safe, and that the public and the police are there to keep you safe. But I think there's also an element of personal responsibility which we can't get away from, and I think that parents have got an enormous responsibility. I know it's difficult for politicians to tell parents how they should be living their lives, but we do have to take responsibility as parents. The stakes are higher than they were when we were young people in terms of the alcohol that is available, and so parents have got to have those discussions with their young people at a young age. But we don't have a lot of resources. Drink Away do some good stuff, but there's not enough support for parents when you're trying to find out what you should be doing, how you should be having that discussion, when you should be starting that discussion, what age. And the schools don't do nowhere near enough. The schools are almost nervous about talking about alcohol, which is crazy, because they're happy to talk about drugs. But for most young people, drugs probably aren't going to be an issue, but alcohol is going to be normal for them because it's a normal part of our life. And they need to have the skills to understand how to navigate it. So I think there is more that schools could and should be doing to help young people and to support parents who want to do the right thing. But it's a great initiative. Very good. I'm hoping you'll be safe this week.
Give me his name and address and I'll make sure Can I just add a little footnote, because Miles and I have been a little bit adversarial, and that makes it good, doesn't it? But I do have a lot of sympathy. I mean, it's if you outlaw fags because they give you cancer, that's very black and white, isn't it? You outlaw drugs because they're addictive, that's very black and white. Many of us in this room, and indeed most of the public, very much enjoy a drink, and it makes you feel better, it makes you good company, and so it's not an unmitigated evil whatsoever, and it's not sort of guaranteed evil trade. It is much harder to tool and tune, isn't it? Something which is good in small bits but terrible in big bits, much harder than these sort of clearly addictive substances. So I'm more sympathetic than I sometimes might be.
One final question, then we're going to have to break up. Is there any more? Right, well, thank you very much for attending. I think what we've all agreed on, although we had a bit of a spat on minimum unit pricing, is that we need a mixture really of enforcement, education, good treatment, health and care, and also something perhaps to make, we don't know what it is, to make cheap booze less readily available, particularly to young people. Thank you all for your questions, which have been sensible, moderate and sober, and I hope that this evening you all behave in the same way. I'm sure it'll be our audience have been very well behaved, but so have our panel, and I'd like to put your hands together and thank everybody for